Hello and welcome to Let's Talk HR with Dr. Deneen, the talk show that spotlights HR professionals and talks about all things HR. The new overtime law. Some call it the new exemption rule under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Do you know about it? Do you know your obligation as an organization regarding it? We're going to learn all about it today. My guest is Malik Luckett, attorney with Phillips, and he will help us navigate through the details of this new sweeping law. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
I am so glad that you're here. We're going to gain insight from you, your insight on this new overtime exemption law. But before we do that, I want to ask you a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about you. You are an attorney with Phillips, and so tell us more.
Yeah, so my name is Malik Luckett. I'm an attorney with Phillips, practicing primarily in labor and employment law.
Yeah.
I've been practicing for about almost 3 years now. Well, I think I just passed 3 years a couple weeks ago.
All right.
So still relatively young and learning a lot about the law. And yeah.
Yeah, emerging leader into the law industry. We love seeing that coming. We love it. So why was law a fascination or interest for you?
Yeah, so it really goes back to middle school for me.
Okay.
So when I was in about 7th or 8th grade, I was fortunate enough to go to Obama's first inauguration.
Okay.
And after that, I became fascinated with him. And then a couple years after that, I read his book, Dreams from My Father.
Wow.
When I was in high school, and then I learned, about his journey and how he, was a public servant at one point and then went to law school and became a lawyer, yada, yada, yada. Long story short, it got me interested in law. But originally when I made the decision to go to law school or that I wanted to be a lawyer, I thought I would be a criminal lawyer. And I soon learned that was not the path for me. So now you see me doing primarily labor and employment law on the civil side.
And something that is much needed. What would organizations do without our employment lawyers? That is so great. So let's dig right in. This new sweeping rule, right? Some call it the exemption rule, some call it the overtime rule. Tell us what the official name is.
Yeah, so like you said, that people call it different things, but Congress has been referring to it as the Restoring Overtime Pay Act of 2023.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
That just basically is saying that we're expounding upon the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Yes.
Which, for those who don't know, is just the general overtime law, right? That law states that people must be paid a minimum wage for 40 hours worked in a week.
Okay.
And if they work over those 40 hours in a week, they must be paid times and a half.
Yes.
And it's calculated on a weekly basis.
And it's calculated on a weekly basis. Right. It's a sweeping law. It must be done. So it impacts a lot of people, a lot of organizations. Tell us who this law affects.
It affects, like you said, everyone, employers and employees alike.
Okay.
So I think employers will need to keep track of any changes in the law. And if you are a non-exempt employee, which we'll talk about what that means in a little bit.
Okay.
If you are a non-exempt employee, you could, your status could be changed to exempt. So, non-exempt and exempt, or vice versa, right? If you're an exempt, you could be changed to non-exempt.
Yeah.
So all employees need to pay attention to what's happening to see, what they're supposed to be getting.
Yeah.
And employers need to make sure they're paying what they're supposed to be paying.
You bring up an interesting point about exempt and non-exempt, and it can change at any time. So is that at the organization's discretion, or can they change it anytime they want, or is it based on law?
Yeah, so it's up to the organization, and when you start a job, oftentimes you sign an employment contract.
Yes.
And most of those contracts have language that states, you can be switched to, you are an at-will employee and you can be switched to non-exempt or exempt at the employer's discretion, like you said. So it really depends on what kind of job you have and where you work, and on whether or not that status can change so quickly.
So quickly, and it can do that. So what about exemptions? Are there any organizations, or who is exempt from this ruling?
Okay, right. So when we talk about exempt, there's a 3 factors test that we look at to determine exemptions. We have our duties test, we have our salary basis test, and we have our salary threshold, which is what the big rah-rah is about right now, the salary threshold. So under the duties test, right, you look at what type of duties the employee is doing on the job.
Okay.
And we break that down into some categories. So you have your executive positions, and those positions are supervisory positions where you have employees who manage other employees.
Yes.
So those are going to be your executive positions.
Uh-huh.
Then you have your administrative positions, which for employers can sometimes be tricky because when we hear administrative, we think of clerical things,
right?
But that's not what it means in this instance. In this instance, it's meaning business or doing work that directly benefits the business, right?
Okay.
So think finance, accounting, quality control, marketing, those types of things.
Those type of things, yeah.
All right. And after, I know it's a long list.
No worries, we're good.
After your administrative positions, you have your professional positions. And those are typically positions that require some sort of prolonged course of knowledge, right? Your legal jobs, your medical jobs, sometimes your engineering jobs, anything that has an extensive technical course of knowledge. After that, you have your computer skills positions.
All right.
And that does not mean, working with a computer, because I work with a computer, but I am not a skilled computer person.
That's not a skilled trade of yours nor mine, so we understand.
When we say computer skilled employees, those are referring to programmers and software engineers, things of that nature.
Yeah.
And lastly, in kind of this broader scheme, you have your outside sales employees, and those are, just employees who don't earn a salary. They're usually commission based, so they're not going to be eligible for overtime.
Okay, all right. So you heard the test, the types of tests, and HR would most likely fall up under. It could be executive, it could be professional, and in some cases, it could be administrative as well, right?
Correct.
But we just don't fall up under that skilled computer. Well, unless you're a data analytic person, but anyway, there's a test. So every job has a test to it. So you talk about the test and you talk about the different categories, how it works. And so in some of those, maybe executive, you have what is called the white collar exemption, all right, or white collar duty. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I just spoke on. Those categories are kind of going to be your white collar exemptions under that duties test. And so when you look at those white collar exemptions, you then look at the salary basis, right? And the salary basis is basically saying this employee is paid a salary, semi-monthly, monthly, whatever the salary payment is. And after you determine, that's easy to meet. But what's difficult to meet is the salary threshold, which is like we said, this is what it's all about here. So the salary threshold amount prior to July 1st, the salary threshold amount was $35,568.
Okay, listen to that. That was prior to
July 1st.
July 1st, okay.
And on July 1st, 2024, it immediately increased to $43,888.
Yes, okay.
And on January 1st of 2025,
yes,
it will increase once again to $58,656.
So there were 3 increments of increases that's attached to the exemption rule, right? And so we had one in July 1st, right? And then immediately again when? After that?
No, we had one July 1st and we'll have another one January 1st of 2025.
Of 2025. And that threshold amount of 2025, which it kept increasing, and that is what?
$58,656.
Okay. So does that mean that in order to be deemed exempt, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, that you must make that amount to be deemed, right?
Correct. In addition to passing the duties test, having a job, whether it's an executive job, administrative job, professional job, and in addition to that salary basis, getting paid on a salary on a monthly or biweekly basis.
So it's 3-pronged.
Yeah, it's a three
So it's not just a sweeping thing that an organization just says, oh, well, we're just going to make it this way. So there's a specific duty. There is a specific, I guess, so to speak, test and analysis that's done, right? In order for this to be deemed. So under exemptions though, if you're exempt, that means you're exempt from overtime, right? So if you make that salary and the company deems you as exempt, that means exactly what it is. You're exempt from overtime, no overtime for you. So what would you say that the advantages and disadvantages for an organization to deem people exempt and non-exempt?
So the advantages for exempt, you know what you're going to have to pay out on a monthly basis.
You already know.
So that's set. Disadvantage on the very opposite end. If you're paying non-exempt people, their standard 40-hour week and times and a half for additional hours worked. If it's a long work week, sometimes people can work upward 20 to 40 hours in overtime.
Yes.
And that could be costly for the company, especially if it's not already, planned in your budget.
Right.
So, that's one of the things. Another thing for, exempt versus non-exempt is just when you have an exempt supervisor, let's say you're a restaurant owner, you can pay your exempt supervisor that set salary regardless of the quality or quantity work.
Okay.
And regardless of, whether or not they work 40 hours or 60 hours, right?
Okay.
You know what you're going to pay, like I said earlier. Whereas when you have non-exempt employees, oftentimes, like I said, that they can work maybe 60 hours a week if the demands are needed. So it's just something that the company needs to look at and make sure they're budgeting to see if they can afford to either pay the salary or pay the overtime.
Yeah, so you have to plan that in the budget for overtime, maybe for specific times of the year when the duties or some type of seasonal work is going to happen where you're going to have to utilize your employees more. You have to plan for that. Right. And I guess it's a good thing, not exempt, 1 hour past that 40. It's gonna be time and a half. So there are advantages, especially for the employee, and there are advantages on the employer's side too, because on the other side, a supervisor, you may work 60 hours, but guess what? You're gonna get that threshold salary. Right. So we talk about these tests, and man, it seems like it could be tedious at some time. So do all courts or all organizations have to do these tests in order to deem classification of the job?
Yeah, pretty much it's going to be universal across all courts, but when it's rolling out, it can be different. We have some news that just came off the press today that's going to be shocking. But generally speaking, right, when we look at the Fair Labor Standards Act, the salary threshold amounts that we're discussing is not even explicitly stated in that statute.
Okay.
That amount is something that the Department of Labor created. And the courts kind of agreed, okay, this is reasonable, we'll adhere to what they said, right? So that is what we refer to as Chevron deference.
You learned it here. Let's Talk HR, Chevron deference. Yeah. Talk about that.
Yeah, so Chevron deference refers to, like in this situation, when a statute doesn't explicitly say something, the administrative agency is allowed to make a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable interpretation on what the law means, and the court would adhere to it. Yes. So in this instance, the Department of Labor said that, prior to July 1st, $35,568 is the salary threshold. So that's what we know. All right. Now, in June of 2024, this year, Chevron was overturned by a case known as Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo.
Okay.
And what that says is basically ignore Chevron deference and what we've held in the past. Now courts have to make their own decision.
Oh, wow.
Right? So that brought in question, well, are the courts going to uphold these salary thresholds? And just last night, I'll read it fresh off the press, we had a Fifth Circuit court basically say yes. So I'll read it directly from what I got from the Department of Labor. It says, in a major win for the Department of Labor, a federal appeals court just ruled that the agency has the power to set a salary basis floor in order for workers to be considered exempt for overtime pay.
Wow.
Yesterday's ruling from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, was by no means a slam dunk, given the Supreme Court recently ripped a great deal of power from federal agencies and told federal judges they should exercise their own independent authority when ruling on these types of rules. But a 3-judge panel from the Conservative Appeals Court agreed with the agency and upheld the salary basis for just months before the new rule takes place on January 1st to raise the minimum salary level to about $59,000. So,
wow. So take all of that and tell us what the main points of it is.
So I think many employers were under the impression that the salary increases would not be upheld because they were so much in such a little amount of time. But already we have courts saying, hey, this is upheld. So you have to abide by it come January 1st, 2025.
Yeah.
But that's not the end all be all, because if it is appealed and sent to the Supreme Court, they could very well say, no, you're wrong. Courts have to make a decision.
So organizations have to adhere to it, and then, oh, you're wrong. Then they may want to go back to what they, oh my gosh, it's a ping pong.
Yep, it's very messy right now.
It's messy.
So it's important to keep up with what's happening, like we said, whether you're an employer or an employee, so you can know what your duties are regarding the law.
Wow, that is great information. And I tell you, organizations will have to step up and decide what they're going to do, and and be good with it, whatever they decide to do. So what brought about this change? What brought about this new rule? Were there concerns about it? Were there grievances about it? What brought about the new change in the new rule?
It was long overdue, right? So the amount that the minimum threshold was just too low.
Okay.
They'd been trying to increase it since 2016 during the Obama administration, a while ago, and it didn't pass.
Okay.
But it benefited some people back then, as there were some salary increases and just in response to it generally. But this year it just it successfully passed. So it seems like it's a bigger jump than what most employers would want to make at one time.
Yes.
You got an employee doing the same job who was once making $35,000. All of a sudden, 6 months later, we got to pay them $58,000.
Yeah.
So so for small mom and pop shops, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Especially if the margins are slim, like they may not have it in their budget to make that payment. Where if you're one of some of these bigger companies and organizations, oh, it's fine, we can pay.
It's
them
fine. We'll just wave the magic wand and it happens, right?
Right.
But reality is it could be challenging for some other organizations as well. So you deem a person exempt. You deem a person non-exempt. What happens if an organization misclassifies their employees? Whether it's intentional or unintentional. What happens?
Great point. Either whether intentional or unintentional, it's a lawsuit.
Waiting to happen. It's waiting to happen. Yes.
Misclassification of employees is one of the easiest way to rack up some fees, some judgments up for your employees, because a small mix up for one employee could easily turn into thousands within a year.
Yes.
Right? In overtime pay.
Yes.
And if you make that same mistake for 10 employees, now we're talking 10,000. And if we make that mistake for, we didn't recognize this 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Now we're at 200,000. You're right. You see how that adds up?
Yeah.
So it's very important to make sure you're properly classifying your employees.
Properly. And I tell you, you do the math. Listen, comply or do the math.
Right.
Do either one. So an exempt employee, a company has a supervisor. It's an advantage for the supervisor to be exempt because they can work those over hours. But here it is. If that supervisor is making $35,000 a year and this new rule says 58, guess what? You're in violation. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you don't increase that pay on January 1st, 2025, that they can very well sue you for not paying them the proper amount that they're owed under the statute. So you got to keep up with, or if you don't want them to be
Mhm.
exempt anymore or non-exempt, make sure you pay them overtime.
Yes.
It's either or. You either have to increase the salary or, demote them to a non-supervisory position and pay them for their 40
Overtime.
hours and
Yeah.
their overtime.
Yeah. So there is a little leeway, but what's the advantage to the employee and what's the advantage to the employer? You have to weigh that out to
Right.
decide what would be best for you. What
Right.
would be best for you. So let's talk about what the employer should do at this point. So what should the employer do at this point, knowing that on January 1st, it's going to be this change? What do they need to do?
Right. So like we said, make sure you're paying attention to what's happening locally and nationally in the courts to see if anything changes. Because like we just discussed, that Fifth Circuit upheld it, but they very well could have said, oh no, you don't have to do it. And that could have brought about a whole nother issue. So right now, keep up with what's happening. That's the first thing. Second, I would suggest you look at your budgets now and see what you're paying and how much you're going to have to pay these employees come January 1st, right? If is it going to stay within the margins? If so, cool, you're good. You can increase the salaries. If not, you may need to consider demoting an employee and paying them hourly plus overtime. So it's one of those two options pretty much, because not ignoring it is not an option. So you're either going to have to, cough up the money for the salary or, make the necessary changes to pay them overtime.
Yeah. And if you're an employee and you're a workaholic, well, that may be an advantage to you because every hour that you're past that 40, right? It's overtime. So we can see the advantages on both sides. So what should employees do?
Yeah.
Should they know what's going on so they're aware? How does that work?
Yeah, so for employees, it's difficult. Like we said, there is some comfortability with having a salary and knowing how much you're going to make on a weekly basis, right? I know I'm going to get this amount every 2 weeks, and I can plan my bills accordingly. If you're all of a sudden switch to an overtime position, right, where you're paid your hourly and then you get your overtime, the company could very well monitor how much overtime you get, which in turn means you make less money than you were making at first. And if that happens, you could see, maybe some spouses having to go back to work or some changes having to be made in childcare or something like that. It can get deep. So I think as an employee, you need to make sure if you are non-exempt, make sure you're getting the amount of money you're supposed to be getting.
Right.
And if you are, in a position to where you're going to get demoted, discuss with your employers how much overtime you're going to get. Right? I can very well see some employees finding new jobs that will pay the salary threshold minimum.
HR professionals, listen to what's happening now. We may see a trend due to this. We'll have to wait and see what happens on that. But go ahead.
It could be it could be good and bad. Like you said, there are some overtime positions where they make a salary on their 40 hours, but they also work 40 hours in overtime a week, so they make more than the supervisors.
Oftentimes.
It's not in every situation, but there are some situations where that happens. So just know your rights and know what you're supposed to be getting paid as an employee.
Yeah. So just being informed,
right?
Keeping up with the law, knowing what your rights are as an employer and an employee, it's going to be to your advantage. So these organizations must stay compliant. So what can organizations do that they ensure that they stay compliant? Is there something they should do? Maybe, do an audit every so often to make sure that you are in compliance with the law, those type things that happen. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, audits are a good way to make sure you're in touch. But if you don't have the manpower to do it, I would suggest talking to your labor and employment attorney.
You got to talk to Malik on this. You got to talk to Malik.
But,
I mean, really.
In all seriousness, talking to your attorney could save you a lot of time and money.
Yes.
So I think that if you are unsure of whether you're compliant, talk to your attorney as soon as possible, before the January 1st deadline, so that when that comes, you'll already be set and have everything in play to be compliant.
Yeah. So what happens on the attorney front when we know these sweeping things are happening? What what do they brace themselves for, or what do they prepare themselves for as we move on with this?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of like y'all. We're monitoring it to see if there are any changes. Like I told you, I got that email this morning for something that happened just last night.
Yes.
And so it's just, in this area of law, even before this salary threshold became a thing, the labor and employment law was also always changing, right? You never know what's different.
Yeah.
You never know how a court ruled on an issue that another court ruled differently on.
Yeah.
So right now, we're just monitoring everything and doing our best to provide advice and counsel to our clients.
Yeah. And so I'm sure that, you're going to be probably getting some calls with regard to it, maybe on the employer front and maybe on the employee side. We'll just have to wait and see. This has been absolutely an amazing show full of information, especially if you're getting the fresh news off the press of the changes that happened in law, right? Was that the Department of Labor? Who did that?
That was a case that the Department of Labor had, but my firm sent me the notification. And you all can sign up. I could do a quick plug if you don't mind.
Yeah.
If you go to www.fisherphillips.com, click on Insights and scroll down, you can subscribe to our newsletter. And just like me, you can get updates on all things labor and employment law across the United States and in Mexico.
All right.
We can service whatever needs you have.
Call Malik. He can service whatever needs you have. But this has been so educational, so informative about what we need to do to prepare for January 1st, 2025 with regard to the overtime rule, exemption law, whatever that is. So, wow, this has been an awesome opportunity to learn so much about the overtime rule and what our obligation is regarding the rule and where we go if your organizations are having challenges. So as HR professionals, we must stay abreast of the new laws and trending strategies and information that promotes a strong and effective workplace culture. HR professionals can be the resource to help educate, guide, and be the trusted advisor to obtain workplace success. Be sure to watch a new episode of Let's Talk HR with Dr. Deneen, the first of every month on the YouTube channel of the same name, and on Comcast Xfinity Channel 17, Monday nights from 8 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Please note, you can watch Let's Talk HR with Dr. Deneen and prior episodes at any time. Go to the YouTube channel and type in the talk show title. Be sure to subscribe, no fee, and click on the notification bell. This is HR TV. I'm Dr. Deneen, and I want to talk HR with you. HR forever. See you next time.